We spoke last, I think, about 7 or 8 years ago, how things have changed. Thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
You know, we're just talking about how now the Trump administration is thinking of imposing a 10% tariff at least on quite a number of nations, a slew of nations, in fact, on the back of what he deems as labor practices. I mean, what do you make of this move as he tries to negotiate an Iran deal?
Yeah, look, the president has used tariffs to try and achieve objectives. That's a legitimate use of America's power to tax, right? It's a very reasonable thing when you think other nations are not behaving in a way that are consistent with the things that matter to your citizens, the people that the president was elected to represent. Hopefully you'll set out clearly this is the expectation, this is the behavior we're trying to achieve. When you do that, you remove the tariff and countries go compete. But I have no problem with the president of the United States making the decision saying, no, this is the right thing to do. And other countries will make their own choices.
But is it perhaps a distraction, meant to be a distraction for the world?
No, it's not a distraction. It's policy. President Trump's been at this on tariffs for decades. This is not a distraction. It's not trying to hide the ball.
At a time when he's actually trying to negotiate.
It's not President Trump trying to distract anyone. That's a silly media narrative. President Trump is simply trying to achieve the objectives that he set out to achieve.
Is he actually getting what he wants? But when you take a look at what's happening with the Iran war, he talked about 3 to 4 weeks now. We're into the 4th month. Has it worked for the U.S.? Has his strategy worked?
Yeah, 4 months. 4 months. That's nothing. Think about how long many wars have gone on, right? This is an incredibly effective military campaign. He has set back the Iranian nuclear program massively, something that no previous president was prepared to do. He set back the Iranian missile program, their ballistic missile capabilities, massively. No other president was willing to do that, to take the risks that were associated with that. He has successfully delivered a superior outcome for not just the United States of America, but for the region, for Israel, for all the participants. And he is giving the Iranian people an opportunity to live a life that is far better than the one they've been suffering under for the last 50 years.
And yet Iran still has leverage. I mean, we talk about how Iran is possibly at its weakest level in 1979.
Because of President Trump.
Yet here we are, Iran still having the capacity to negotiate with the U.S. It still has, those missiles
no
that
doubt.
threaten the world.
They still have some missiles. They still have the intention of building a nuclear weapon. The rump regime is confused. It's on its back foot. But yes, it can still put mines in the water and Shahed drones in the air. This means there's still work to do. President Trump is determined to achieve an objective that gets the Strait open, that delivers an opportunity to the Iranian people. No president has put the world in a position where this opportunity was in front of us like we see it today.
So we can expect a deal.
It's up to the Iranians. In the end, the Iranian regime is a bunch of thugs. They're a bunch of theocrats. They believe in the destruction of Israel and the destruction of the great state, the United States of America. I think it's very unlikely that we reach any deal that makes any sense. They've signed multiple documents and have exactly honored 0 of them. No reason to expect that any agreement they would sign with this president or any other president would be honored by them. We have to watch what the Iranians do, not what they say are right.
Well, right now, the perception out there is that the Israelis are the ones in the way of a deal between the U.S. and Iran, because Israel and the U.S. have different perspectives on how this war should end. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's nonsense.
Why is that?
It's just total nonsense. The President of the United States is making decisions that are in the best interest of the United States of America. This story somehow that he was being controlled by Netanyahu, or now he's ignoring Netanyahu. President Trump is evaluating what makes the most sense. How do we achieve the ultimate objectives of keeping the American people safe from the regime that has killed hundreds of Americans over the last years? We shouldn't forget. The Iranian regime hosts al-Qaeda. The headquarters of al-Qaeda sits in Tehran. They killed 3,000 of our people on 9/11. The president is determined to achieve an outcome that is far superior to where we were when President Obama signed a silly nuclear deal. And I'm confident President Trump will continue to deliver against that commitment.
Mike, didn't you say that the deal that President Trump is trying to sign is in no way putting America first?
Well, we don't know what a piece of paper may or may not be signed.
Why did you say that, though?
No, I didn't say that. What I said was the Strait needs to be opened. We're going to have to achieve that, whether that's because the Iranian regime capitulates and allows it to be opened, or we have to pry it up with our hands and at the risk of Americans. I don't know the answer to that. I hope the Iranian regime will come to its senses. Just today, they fired at Bahrain and Kuwait simultaneously. They fired into Israel through their proxy Hezbollah. They have continued to support Hamas, who has not disarmed. The Iranian regime still has capabilities, and we're going to have to do the hard work to convince them either to give up those capabilities or to behave in a fundamentally different way. And whether we sign a piece of paper associated with that or not, I think President Trump understands this regime far better than any previous president ever has.
What would you do? I mean, you've had direct experience, dealing with the Iranians. What would you do differently?
Yeah, I continue to have experience with them. They're trying to kill me still. Right, they have a fatwa on my head. This Iranian regime is trying to kill many former American government officials and has killed many Americans over the years. I would continue to put the economic pressure on them that we have. This blockade is putting enormous pressure on the regime. I'm confident they are confused. I'm confident they are fractured. I think you see that in the Iranian responses with stories of people threatening to resign or not resign. I think there's lots of chaos inside of Iran, and that can only be good for those of us who believe in human rights, basic dignity, and property rights, something the Iranian regime is never going to honor in its current configuration.
If it is so clear that the Iranians have been weakened so dramatically, why not just take the action? I mean, some have suggested it is straightforward. Just open it up. Do as much damage as you can on Iran and let the world go on.
Yeah,
but yet it's so difficult. It's not straightforward, is it, Mike?
When you go do that, you put more American lives at risk. And so this is a difficult decision that only presidents can make, and they'll make it based on the decision that they have. I think it is very likely that we will have to go back at it and provide more weaponry to the Israelis and fight alongside them to do more damage to the Iranian regime, kinetic damage. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope in the end the Iranian regime comes to a fundamentally different decision. The Iranian people get control of that nation. If that's the case, then the Iranian regime the Iranian people could be welcomed back into the world of civilized humanity.
Can we see long-term peace? What would that take?
Oh, yeah. No, we can. We're far closer to it today than we have been under any previous president. Not only did we do the good work that delivered the Abraham Accords, right, multiple nations recognizing the fundamental right of Israel to exist during the president's first term, now you have the Gulf Arab states all understanding that their primary threat, right, their primary threat was never from Israel. Their primary threat is from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they can now all see that. And they've seen that their Muslim brothers fired on them, right? It wasn't the United States or Israel that fired on Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Kuwait. It was the Muslim theocracy headquartered in Tehran. They can all see that.
But the U.S. moved unilaterally. The U.S. moved unilaterally without consulting its allies. Surely there's reason to distrust the position of the U.S.
I am very confident the Gulf Arab states are thrilled at the damage that's been inflicted on the Iranian regime. They are far safer today, and every one of them knows it.
How about the relations between the U.S. and China? Where is it today, you think? How are you assessing the bromance we saw in Beijing between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump?
Don't mistake personal interactions for the relationship between nations. The Chinese Communist Party is intent on creating global hegemony. Xi Jinping has said it himself. He has said that Taiwan is part of his nation. That's indecent and wrong, factually. And I think the United States fundamentally understands that. It is working with its allies and partners in the region to achieve that. And you can watch the economic activity that President Trump has taken to strengthen the American economy and put the Chinese economy on its back foot. I think that's where we find ourselves today. And that's not because of Washington. That's because of the choices that Beijing has made. Beijing has made the choice to be an aggressive nation that has gone to war with every one of its bordering nations. Kinetic war. That's not how the United States operates. It's not how we roll. We hope that the leadership in China will fundamentally come to its senses and decide, no, it just wants to go compete in the world and not dominate the world in a way that denies basic human rights, imprisons 1 million Muslims in the western part of its nations, committing genocide. That's indecent and not a partner for the United States of America.
Despite what you're saying, I hear you. Despite what you're saying, though, the world is reassessing its relationship with the U.S. and also perhaps, the strategic relationships for themselves. We've had nations talking about a reset. We talk about Prime Minister Mark Carney talking about a world in rupture. People are reassessing the strategic alliances, and that is because of the U.S., not because of China.
I'm convinced that these nations will all decide that their best partner is not the Chinese Communist Party. that their best partner is not the Islamic Republic of Iran, that their best partner is not the Communist Party of Russia. They will conclude that Western civilization depends on the United States of America and its leadership, and they will continue to work alongside us to achieve that. I'm thoroughly convinced of that.
Is there a softening in the stance that the U.S. is adopting towards China? I ask because when we listened to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, over the weekend at the Shangri-La Dialogue, there was no mention of Taiwan. Presumably, this is a U.S. that is trying to still redefine its relations with China.
Yeah,
more like a rival.
No,
not a foe.
The Chinese Communist Party is an adversary of the United States of America. I think that's abundantly clear. They certainly think so. They've been at war with the United States economy for 40 years. And we have to respond to that. It's not between the United States and China. This is between Western civilization and a model of a Marxist-Leninist regime that sits in the Chinese Communist Party. It's not the Chinese people that believe that's the right course of action. It is the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping. And this administration, right, President Trump said he was going to talk to the leader of Taiwan. Pete Hegseth Secretary Hegseth may not have mentioned it, but this administration has moved more weaponry and has put more effort into making alliances in the region than any previous administration, including even what we were able to accomplish in the first Trump administration. I think they ought to lean into that and continue to advance the United States economy in a way that delivers good outcomes for Western civilization. I've watched what they've done so far, and I'm confident they'll continue to do that in the remaining 2.5 years.
Is Taiwan still key in America's strategy towards China?
Yeah, it's key for a number of reasons. One, it's a big piece of the first island chain, so as a military geostrategic matter, that is just the way the Western Pacific is laid out. It matters an awful lot to American security. We have forces in Guam, we have forces in the region in Japan, in South Korea, so it is critically important as a military matter for sure. It's also important as a commercial matter. It hosts some of the most advanced technologies that your car, my car, our phones all run on. It is very important that that not be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So yes, that's deeply in the interest of the United States of America to make sure that Taiwan doesn't either come under the actual or even the perceived or political control of the Chinese Communist Party.
So is it worrying that Pete Hegseth refused to answer the question on whether or not the U.S. will proceed with the arms sales to Taiwan?
No,
How are you reading that?
I'm not worried about it at all.
Why not?
I'm very confident the United States will do the necessary to continue to provide the support for the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese government that makes sense for the United States of America and for our allies in the Pacific as well.
Might it be a bargaining chip in U.S.-China relations?
I think that's incredibly unlikely. I think that's a made-up left-wing media story.
Why that? Why is that?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the left-wing media why they're making that story up. It's not going to be a bargaining chip. Taiwan matters. The United States is going to do the necessary.
How are you assessing the biggest risks for Asian nations right now? We've seen how China has been a bit more aggressive in the South China Sea. What do you think the U.S. deem as its role and its priorities in this part of the world?
Oh, sure. Look, I don't know that it's been more aggressive in the South China Sea. They built a military outpost when they promised President Obama they wouldn't in the Rose Garden in 2015, if I have the year right. They've been incredibly aggressive in the South China Sea for a long time, right? They claim that it's just their big lake. So this is a continued challenge that we all have to confront. The Chinese will use their economic leverage against the Pacific nations, right? The island nations in the Pacific, Australia. They'll try and use economic power against Southeast Asian countries as well. What that means is that the alliance must stick together, right? The friends, the good people, the people who believe in basic human rights and dignity have to hang together, work together. I'm confident they will continue to do that alongside of us. And that we'll be there to support them. We are a Pacific nation. I think Secretary Rubio used those words just the other day. We're a Pacific nation. The United States has an enormous interest in keeping free and open navigation through not only the Strait of Taiwan, but the Straits of Malacca as well, and making sure that the entire world operates on a model that doesn't look like the one that Beijing wants.
It's also a U.S. that wants its allies to contribute in a more significant way in terms of defense. What do you think Asian nations can do to that end?
Yeah, they should contribute more to their own defense.
Yeah, but what kind of relationship should they be having, perhaps with the U.S. or, amongst themselves? I mean, how should they position themselves strategically?
So every nation must do the necessary to defend their own sovereignty. They should have friends, they should have allies and partners, but in the end, leaders have the responsibility of their own people to do that which is needed to take care of their own borders, their own boundaries, and their own nation's sovereignty. And so smaller countries will need partners and friends. The United States has been a great friend and partner for nearly every one of those nations in Southeast Asia for decades. They should expect that to continue, but they should also step up. More of their own resources, more of their own capabilities, more of their own tools brought to bear to protect themselves, and then they should work alongside their other partners in the region. Here we sit in Singapore today, a great American partner for the United States of America, hugely strategic for our efforts here in the Pacific. They should behave in a way that Singapore has behaved and see that their own defense matters for their own people. And when they get that right, I am very confident that we'll be a solid partner for them for years to come.
When might the next flashpoint be?
Oh, goodness. One can never do predictions.
What are you concerned about?
I'm concerned about the Chinese Communist Party, its continued efforts to undermine nations throughout the world, Africa, South America, certainly in Asia as well. I'm worried about political Islam. Political Islam is still alive. Radical Islamism is something that we've seen invade pockets of Europe. We've seen risk of that in Southeast Asian countries as well. Like the largest Muslim nations aren't in the Middle East. They're frankly not very far from where we're sitting today. We need to make sure that radical Islam is continued to be watched, that counterterrorism efforts remain strong. Those are things that impact people that are here in Singapore and all across this region deeply and every day.
How about the state of the politics in the U.S.? I mean, some have suggested perhaps you might run in 2028. Might that be the case?
Oh, goodness knows what the Lord will bring. That's an awful long way off. We're having elections even as we sit here today, primary elections today.
Might you be interested, Mike?
We'll see what happens. I want to make sure that whoever it is the United States elects understands the threats in the world in a way that protects the American people. If I can be part of that in some way, so be it.
But it is an America that no longer wants to play the role of a policeman in the world, correct?
No, I don't think there's any role to be the policeman, but we're going to continue to lead the world. We're the most exceptional nation in the history of civilization, and without American leadership, the world is a far more dangerous place. America's not going to walk away from that.